Hey, welcome to Urban Legends. This is Jim. I'm back. Actually, never went anywhere. I've just been, I don't even want to say slacking. Uh, I've just been really busy with work and just with life. Um, okay, let's get into it. I saw this video a few days ago on TLDR News. They're talking about the forms of ownership that are common in the US. And ownership, I mean housing, how people own not just like detached single family or townhomes, but also apartments and apartment buildings in general. I think it's important to understand the differences in ownership because you can't really, it's really difficult to have a conversation about housing without understanding the nuances. Um, and it it might seem like it shouldn't matter, but it winds up being important when you get into really the details of development and development standards and how those things can happen, and how those things get financed really ultimately, because that's where like you can make all the plans you want, but the rubber meets the road at financing. Someone's got to pay to build these things and take the risk before buyers come in and sort of buy up the little pieces that pay back the original investors. So let's just jump into this. This is going to be interesting.
There's a lot wrong with the UK property market. Building property is impossible, buying property is inordinately expensive, and renting property is both expensive and miserable.
Buying and renting property being expensive and miserable uh, is really common throughout the English speaking world. And really, it's, it's pretty common throughout the developed world, especially over the last 10 to 15 years, I'd say. Um, and I think this is a hangover of the 2008 recession, the GFC, whatever you want to call it, and the low interest rates that we had for at least a decade that just dumped capital into the property market. Um, Not a good idea. I mean, it's one way to get us out of the recession, I guess, but and wouldn't you know it, I woke up this morning and was going through my news feed, and there's this piece from TLDR News about Catalan independence, and something that I've been interested in for a while, because almost every trip I've been on to Spain has either started or ended in Barcelona, Girona, Figueres. So I'm like, yeah, let me watch this. And like 2 minutes in, they start talking about the Spanish property crisis, which is basically what we're all going through now, that happened there like 15 years ago. And the same exact pattern where German banks are just pumping a ton of money into the Spanish property market. House prices double, and then the GFC happens, and it just pulls the rug out from the whole thing. And home prices didn't go back to where they were, but they probably lost like 25-30% of their value.
And one party would usually win enough seats in the Spanish legislature to either form an outright majority government or a functioning minority government, i.e., a minority government that occasionally relies on other smaller parties to pass legislation, but where all ministers are from the winning party. However, Spanish politics became significantly more volatile and contentious in the 2010s, mainly thanks to the Eurozone crisis. Spain was particularly affected by the crisis, largely because it was accompanied by an enormous housing crash. In part because other European banks, especially German banks, had invested tons of money in Spanish property, Spanish house prices essentially doubled between 2004 and 2008. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, money stopped flowing into the Spanish property market, and prices started falling. This was then exacerbated by the Eurozone crisis in the 2010s, which put serious strain on Spain's national finances and stunted the European economy more widely. For most of the 2010s, Spain suffered with appallingly high unemployment, crippling austerity, and stagnant growth. All in all, this meant that Spain endured basically a decade of economic turmoil, which had a destabilizing effect on its politics.
But anyway, um, yeah, it caused a ton of chaos, and I guess my point is that um, the same thing the same thing has happened in the U.S. and Australia. Like mortgage rates were so low for so long that you just can't you can't just keep pumping that amount of money into one asset class for a decade, for 15 years, and expect not to see consequences. And eventually there will be an adjustment. It just sucks for everyone in the meantime. Let's keep going.
However, one of the things that makes the UK's property market unequivocally bad is a British idiosyncrasy that basically means that millions of Brits who think they own their homes outright, in fact, merely own a lease to live on the land for a finite amount of time, leaving them at the mercy of the so-called freeholder.
So, a few things here. A leasehold is not it's not unique to the UK. I know this exists in Australia, and we definitely have it here in the US as well, with I think a few nuances. It's not, I wouldn't say it's common in the US, but it's not exactly unheard of. I think it would be more unheard of for residential property to have a shorter term lease than 99 years, because the assumption is, if you're building a house on that land that someone else owns, that you should be able to live your life in it and then pass it on to your children for them to live out their lives. I mean, of course, the assumption is that, 100, 200 years ago, people had much shorter lifespans than they do today. But the other part of that is that this concept of leasehold and freehold goes back to the Magna Carta, really. And like the very foundation of common law. And freehold basically just means that you own your land free and clear. There are no encumbrances. Like no one has a lien on it. You're not, the bank doesn't own 2/3 of it, and you're just slowly chipping away at the principal. So yes, the leasehold exists in all common law countries. It's just less common in the US when it comes to residential property, but not unheard of. Okay, let us continue.
Who effectively acts as an inconvenient landlord. Now, this is a problem that even the Tories now recognise, which is why last year the government proposed to abolish the system and introduced the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Bill. So in this video, we're going to explain what leaseholds are, why people don't like them, and what the new bill will do to address them. Leasehold is a form of property ownership whereby the occupier essentially buys the right to live in the property for a certain period of time, but the building itself, or the land it's built on, is still owned by someone else, known as the freeholder. Now, if you're one of our international viewers, this might sound a bit weird, and that would be because England and Wales are literally the last two countries in the developed world where leaseholds are still widely used.
Yeah, that's probably fair to say that it's not widely used here, but it's used occasionally. And I guess something I forgot to mention earlier is the reason that leasehold evolved is that I guess it is kind of medieval in a way, but it's not completely unnecessary these days either. Like, so say you're a farmer and you are neighbors with another farm, and they're not farming all of their land, and you want more land to farm, but they don't necessarily want to sell their land to you. Maybe they want to leave it to their kids down the road or something. So you can lease it from them for 20, 30 years, whatever. You can build a barn on it, build sheds for your equipment and all that kind of thing. And going back even further, 200, 300 years ago, you could build a house on the land because you're going to live where you farm. There are no cars to drive you back and forth from your house somewhere else. So yeah, that's the idea behind a leasehold property. Of course, we don't live in an agrarian society anymore, so it's less common, but that doesn't mean that it's unnecessary, like an unnecessary legal instrument. Like there are definitely some use cases for it.
Today, there are around 5 million leaseholds in the UK, including the vast majority of flats in urban areas, which represent about 20% of the English housing stock. In basically every other country in the world, you either buy your property outright, or if you buy, say, a flat in a larger block of flats, you buy what's known in the UK as a common hold, i.e., you and the other residents are jointly responsible for the overall building rather than some third-party freeholders.
Yeah, so this common hold property in the UK is what we would call a condominium in the US, and I think what's usually called a strata title in Australia. As in Canada, it would be called a condo as well. But it means the same thing. It basically means that there's like the resident owners, or I guess owners is more accurate for a condo or common hold, is that you own the unit, you basically own what's inside, but the land that the building is sitting on is owned in common. Usually, well, at least in the US scenario, those owners would form a corporation that would collect funds to pay for maintenance on the exterior of the building and any other landscaping outside. If there's a pool with the property, then that would also be part of the maintenance costs. And this is what in the US people often complain about their HOA and their HOA fees and that sort of thing. And that's essentially what that is. Although really an HOA can exist independently of a condominium. So you can own your land fee simple, and you can own the house, you can own the land that the house is on, but in your deed there can be a restriction or a sort of capitulation to the HOA, that sort of thing, that can be really hard to get removed. Like you basically have to get all the neighbors to agree to sort of extinguish the HOA. All right, anyway.
Now, despite being a little bit odd, for most of recent history, the system worked relatively well. Freeholders generally didn't charge exorbitant fees, and the leases offered were usually so long, in tens if not hundreds of years, that the buyers didn't really worry about renewing or negotiating them. In fact, today, most prospective buyers treat leaseholds and freeholds as nearly identical, which is why leasehold properties sell for basically the same amount as their freehold equivalents.
Yeah, see, that's crazy. I would never expect to pay the same amount because you're not buying the land. You're just renting the land. You may be buying the building that's on it. You may have a right to clear the land, but you're not actually buying the land. So why would you be paying for it? Yeah. And it's also the same with a condo too. Like even if it's a detached house, it could still be a condominium. And I would never pay as much for that either, because by the time you factor in the condo fees that you pay every month, that could be $400, $500, $700 a month. It's not worth it to me to pay more for that.
The point we're making here is that leasehold is widely considered a normal form of property ownership in England and Wales, even though it's in some ways a lot more like a long-term rental. However, despite this, the system has always been ripe for abuse, for the simple reason that freeholders can exploit the fact that they can extract massive rents from leaseholders. This is both because no one really wants to leave their home, but also because selling your leasehold is almost impossible if there's an ongoing dispute with the freeholder. So if your freeholder imposes some massive costs and you resist or refuse them, then it's likely you can't even sell your house to get away from it all.
It'd actually be, I don't know if this is big in the UK. I know it's a lot more difficult when you have a masonry house, but in the US, and I saw it quite a bit in Australia too, where people would just move their house. A a lot of times it's like people found a really like the really like their house, or it was like an older Victorian, or a craftsman or something like that, and they found a bigger piece of land, or like a place in a neighborhood that was more convenient. And there are companies that's what they specialize in, is moving houses. Anyway, it'd be hilarious if your leaseholder was trying to rake you over the coals, and you just said, no, you know what, that's fine, I'll be out of here in 3 months, and just hire a company to move your house to a cheaper spot.
Now, leaseholder abuse first became a politically salient problem in the 1990s, after leaseholds had taken off in the late to mid 20th century, with the vast expansion of dense blocks of flats in cities.
This is pretty interesting, and for two reasons, really, that they mention this, and also that I've been working on another script that specifically deals with this topic, and that's specifically how recent apartments are in the English-speaking world, and especially high-rise apartments, because going back like thousands of years, in most of Northern Europe, you either had detached houses, or more recently, like late Middle Ages, you started to see more townhomes. And even the townhomes didn't really take off until, the Industrial Revolution, when like hundreds of thousands of people started moving to cities. So like it's not that no one ever lived in an apartment. They were just really rare. And for the most part, apartment buildings came from the Mediterranean, and they like came to Northern Europe as a Roman export. And in ancient Rome, apartment buildings were fairly common as insulae. But you see that style of housing around the Mediterranean, and it seems obvious that the Romans didn't invent it, but maybe that they borrowed it from the Greeks or from the Phoenicians. I don't know. It's something that I need to research before my next video. But yeah, apartments were just not common in Northern Europe, and thus not common in North America until pretty recently. And then, even though apartment buildings were somewhat common in cities like New York, high-rise buildings didn't exist before the elevator. And that's 130 years ago, 140 years ago.
Now, often for simplicity, individual flat owners were sold leaseholds rather than freeholds, and developers or some other institution maintained control of the freehold. However, at the end of the millennium, stories started appearing about freeholders charging exorbitant ground rents and service charges, which leaseholders weren't consulted on and couldn't really resist. Many leaseholders today complain that freeholders behave as landlords when it suits them, i.e., freeholders justify their exorbitant service costs on the grounds that they're acting as diligent landlords. But whenever work actually needs doing on the property, they tell the leaseholders that it's their responsibility because they're the homeowner.
It seems like if in any kind of lease, and it doesn't matter if you're just leasing an apartment for a year or you're leasing a piece of property for 99 years, that you would want all of those details very clearly spelled out in the lease. Who's responsible for what? So, is it caveat emptor in Latin, right? I'm not blaming people for the system, just that it seems weird that there would be an argument back and forth over who was responsible for what. It should be in writing, is all I'm saying.
And this has all become a real issue since the Grenfell Tower disaster, after the government introduced new fire safety and cladding regulations for blocks of flats.
So this is even more weird to me, because we had that building collapse down in near Miami a couple of years ago, that condo collapse. And so in that case, right, it was the people who were elected by the residents to serve on the board of the condo association that were deferring maintenance. And I don't, you know, it could be the case that the cost of repair was more than the building was worth. I don't know. But I guess I'm just saying that in the case of that building collapse, ultimately it's with the fault of the people who live there. There was no outside party. And I guess, again, it seems like when you have an apartment building that went up in the 1960s or 70s or whenever, that those things would be carefully spelled out, like who was responsible for what. Like if you rent a house in my neighborhood, it's going to be in the lease that, hey, the resident is responsible for cutting the grass once a week, or taking out the trash, or whatever. It's like, it's clearly defined what services you're paying for and which ones you're responsible for. Anyway.
In many cases, the freeholders of the affected blocks have either tried to pass on the entire cost to the leaseholders or just refused to do the work, leaving leaseholders effectively unable to sell their now unsafe properties. And to make matters worse, more recently, developers have even started building more leasehold houses, which obviously makes even less sense than flats, given that there's not even any communal space, with hidden and onerous ground rents snuck into these homes. A common one is for a ground rent that doubles every 5 to 10 years, which might not sound that bad, but for anyone who's familiar with exponential growth knows that doubling every 5 years means that your ground rent would go up more than 3,000% over 25 years. And that makes it very difficult to sell this type of property. For all of these reasons, leaseholds have become increasingly unpopular, and polling suggests that something like 57% of leaseholders today regret buying a leasehold property. You get the idea then. Leaseholds are British anomalies that have become increasingly controversial in the past few years. And perhaps as a result, support for reform now interestingly crosses the entire political spectrum. Labour and the left see the leasehold system as basically a neo-feudal con, a mechanism for perpetuating class inequality by denying real ownership to aspiring homeowners and keeping actual control in the hands of a few moneyed landowners. But many Tories also feel uncomfortable with the current system.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely appreciate that. It's a difficult line to thread, because, obviously you don't want a ton of accumulation of property, and I don't really know how difficult that is, right? Because, like, it's gonna be really difficult for any one individual or company to buy up, a huge part of the property market. And in situations where it isn't, or in economies where it isn't, that's kind of the job of the government in the US. That would be like maybe the Federal Trade Commission, to step in and say, hey, you can't own more than X% of the property market in this metro area or this state or the whole country, or all three even. All right.
Some moderate conservatives oppose leaseholds on similar grounds, but even many right-wing Tories who might not share Labour's anxiety about inequality are also wary of leaseholds. For starters, they're distinctly anti-Thatcherite. Thatcher famously believed in the so-called property-owning democracy, and that widespread homeownership was the best protection against the dangers of socialism, because giving people capital in the form of property was the best way of turning them into capitalists.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. I don't know that you need to really turn people into capitalists to get people to appreciate owning their land, or owning what's the land underneath their house. It's just a matter of like personal security and wanting to be able to leave that for your children if they want it, which is next to impossible if you have a short leasehold.
On top of that, many free market Tories think that leaseholds look suspiciously monopolistic. Leaseholders are sort of captive consumers who can't shop around for alternatives, and freeholds are generally pretty difficult to buy, i.e., there's high barriers to entry. Anyway, this is why last year Michael Gove announced that the government wanted to abolish the leasehold system, which he described as feudal. However, when the much anticipated Leasehold and Freehold Bill was introduced to Parliament in November, it fell conspicuously short of Gove's rhetoric. In its current form, the bill would ban new leasehold houses, but not new leasehold flats, and essentially make it easier for existing leaseholders to renew their leases or renegotiate better terms. Now, the government's argument for these more modest reforms is that retroactively amending leaseholds would require breaking pre-existing contracts between leaseholders and freeholders, and that commonholds aren't necessarily a better option than leaseholds, because, as anyone who lives in a shared building will know, coordinating works and repairs with your neighbours can be pretty difficult.
Yeah, and like I just mentioned, that tower collapse in South Florida a few years ago was directly a result of deferred maintenance, and apparently something that there had been a lot of internal strife and arguments within the building about what work needed to be done and how quickly. But at the same time, if the leaseholder's not doing the work anyway and is off the hook, then it shouldn't really matter. It seems like where this is going is that a leasehold system is bad in an urban scenario, at least for housing, but that it might be useful for commercial property, for say office buildings, or like a stadium or something like that gets renovated every 30, 40 years. And it definitely has uses in rural scenarios.
Nonetheless, Labour aren't convinced, and they've pledged to bring forward legislation within the first 100 days of a Labour government, which would, quote, replace private leasehold flats with a workable commonhold solution, and ban both new leasehold houses and flats. Now, given the polls, this means that, unless the Lords amend the current bill to make it happen earlier, leaseholds are probably going to be scrapped soon after the next election. And this is probably good news, both in and of itself, and because it's a symptom of the fact that politicians are finally devoting political capital to the raging housing crisis.
And there was another little bit in here about why the law wasn't passed the last time around. And they kind of referenced it obliquely as like a problem between, like, creating problems in the leasehold contracts. And I could see passing a law that prohibited new leasehold contracts for residential property or something, for apartments, or limited to specific areas or something like that. But it would be pretty difficult legally to do that for existing contracts. Like you would be challenged immediately in court. And in the US we have takings law through the Fifth Amendment, but that law exists in common law anyway. You can't take someone's property without just compensation. So apparently, even though this exists in common law, if there was legislation passed in the UK, the courts couldn't challenge it because those rights that exist through common law only exist in the absence of legislation. So if the legislature passes a law to take that right away, then it's gone. Whereas in the US, because we have those protections in the Bill of Rights, the court can effectively overturn legislation that is deemed to violate one of those rights. Land of the free, I guess, right? Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are not going to have sympathy because, and you can see in the entire video, they're making references to monopoly. But I would imagine that a lot of the people who are those freeholders, just like landlords in the US, are not big banks and tycoons. A lot of them are just people who own the house that they live in and another house down the street. Maybe they own 2 or 3 properties, but they're not, they would lose their livelihood if their lease was taken away. And still, I can understand that, not everybody's going to be sympathetic to that. But for obvious reasons, there are legal protections, and not just like recent legal protections, but historical legal protections, because of the problems that it causes socially and economically when you start depriving people of their property, or contracts that they've entered into. So anyway, I would imagine that when this law does come out in the UK, that it's going to avoid that entirely and just prohibit people from entering into new leaseholds. And yeah, it's definitely something I'm going to watch and to see how this progresses, because in the US it's way more common for commercial leaseholds than for residential leaseholds. And and that's like, it's kind of obvious when you think about it, especially in the US context, that retailing is always changing, and so is office. And it's these buildings, they go up and they're not, 30 years later, 40 years later, they're ready to be torn down, and someone new will come in and scrape the site and start all over again. But if you and those commercial developers, they don't want to pay a ton of money for the land. They don't, they're not interested in paying $2 million for the land, because that business might only be there for 10 years. The business might only be leasing the space for 7, 8, 10 years. And it doesn't it doesn't make any sense in that market to buy and sell property. It just makes doing business so much more expensive. So, those 50 and 100-year leases are fairly common in the commercial world in the US. Okay, anyway, that's enough for tonight. I'm Jim. This is Urban Legends. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.